A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of sexual violence and child sexual assault. Please listen with care.
A listener production.
In the early 1990s, a serial predator terrorised Melbourne's inner north, preying on women in their own homes, some elderly, one pregnant, and all of them alone. No one felt safe. Mostly, he crept in as they slept, and before fleeing, he always made them count to 100 before they could call for help. The media called him the Ascot Vale Rapist. As fear gripped the city's inner northern suburbs, a 3-person team of forensic scientists was working around the clock, using a range of new DNA techniques that would help crack the case in a way that would have been impossible only a few years earlier. Part of that team was Anna Davey, a pioneer in forensic DNA analysis and now one of Australia's most respected forensic educators and quality assurance experts. In this episode, discover how forensic science not only exposed the Ascot Vale Rapist, but also proved the innocence of a man wrongly arrested for the crimes. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
In early 1993, a number of women in the Ascot Vale area reported somebody had broken into their house and raped them. The police obviously investigated those cases and saw that there were similarities. Particularly, the offender asked the women to count to 100 before they moved or they called anyone, and that allowed him time to get away. So a police task force was set up, and because of the characteristic that he asked them to count to 100, the task force was named Operation Century. The police had been bringing in these samples to the laboratory for investigation prior to them being linked together. Some of the samples were samples taken from the victims, so what are known as forensic medical samples. Other samples were taken from the premises because he was known to ejaculate on windows and doors of the victims, but didn't actually go into the house. So we'd started profiling these cases. There is always, in a forensic lab, a backlog of cases. Cases aren't examined immediately they walk in the door, like they are on TV. They have to sit in a queue. And so many of these cases were still in the queue. So they hadn't been linked together at the forensic end, but the police had linked these cases together on the circumstances of the case. So when that happened, a team was put together at the laboratory to focus on these cases, and these cases basically came to the front of the queue. And the team that was developed only worked on these cases. As far as I understand, he was a very prolific rapist. He raped very frequently, or he attacked women very frequently, and sometimes he actually went back to the same victim and attacked her again. And I believe there was quite a lot of disquiet in the community, particularly with women who were living alone.
And at that very early stage, did the police have any suspects?
I believe they had a lot of suspects. Many of the women couldn't identify the person who'd raped them, so basically they'd gone back to first principles policing, checking out people known to themselves, and they developed a long list of suspects, but I wasn't actually part of that side of the investigation.
How did you first become involved in the case? Was it automatic that it went to you?
Well, there was a number of reasons why I was involved. Once the police had decided that there was a serial rapist, they established a task force, and we established a team within the Forensic Science Laboratory to work on these cases. I was doing some work with a new DNA technology known as PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which actually gave results much quicker than the traditional DNA profiling technique that we'd been using. And so I was introduced as the DNA person on that team. We had a forensic biologist, myself, and the assistant director of the laboratory, Dr. Tony Raymond, who liaised with the police. So there was a three-person team, and I was the DNA person.
So when you're actually doing DNA analysis, what actually are you analysing?
Okay, if I can take a step back and explain what DNA is. DNA is a number of very large molecules or chemicals that are found in basically every cell of the body. There's a few exceptions, but basically every cell of the body. And it contains all the information that the body needs to actually function. It's basically the instruction manual. There's certain sections of the DNA which provide information that says that we're human, that we've got 2 arms, 2 legs, one nose, etc., unless you've got a medical condition, and that doesn't vary between people. So that's no use to us because we're not trying to match people, we're trying to differentiate between people. The next type of DNA that's contained, or the next set of information that's contained in the DNA, is the information that has a limited amount of variability. So that would be hair colour, eye colour, height, those sort of things that we can use to recognise people. Would include blood groups, those sort of things. So there's a limited amount of variation, but there's not unlimited variation. For instance, green hair is not natural. It's not included in there, so there's only a limited amount of variation. The area we use for forensic science is the third area, and that's areas that at this stage don't seem to code or contain information specifically for the body's function. And within that area, there is a huge amount of variation. And so what we look at is we focus on that areas of DNA that's got huge amount of variation. One of the ways in which it varies, and there's a number of ways, but the one that we focus on is that we find that there are short segments of DNA which are repeated again and again and again and again. And in some people, that section at that particular area of DNA might be repeated 6 times. And in somebody else, it might be repeated 12 times. And so we look at the number of times that piece of DNA has been repeated. Now, because we look at a large number of DNA loci, that allows us to distinguish between people.
Once you were on that case, what was the first kind of testing that you had to do?
So the first testing was actually undertaken by a colleague who did the serological testing. Serological testing is the examination of markers that are in the blood, usually proteins of one sort or another. The most well-known is the ABO blood grouping system. The problem with this is that you can only divide the population into 4 different groups. You're either an A, a B, an AB, or an O. And he was able to do that test very quickly. It's a very efficient test. And he was able to either include 2 samples or exclude a sample on the basis of that testing.
And of course, these days, it's one test and you get a DNA profile. In those days, it was very different. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so the traditional testing, DNA testing we were doing in those days was known as restriction fragment length polymorphisms, or RFLPs. And we looked at a whole of 5 loci. Now, a loci is an area of DNA. So we were looking at 5 areas of DNA. That test took 6 weeks. We couldn't speed it up. That's just how long it took. The new technique which I used in this particular case was known as polymerase chain reaction. And that was a new technique we were just introducing. We were looking at 3 areas of DNA. I should say that these days, the DNA laboratories are looking at 24 areas of DNA. So it has moved on considerably. But in those days, there was three areas. Polymerase chain reaction is a mechanism that allows us to copy multiple times, in fact, millions of times, the area of DNA that we're interested in. It's sort of like if you think of DNA as a large book, then it's like photocopying one page millions of times. So we end up with millions of copies of the area of DNA that we're looking for. And that test is actually much quicker than the traditional testing that we were using.
This is 1993, so still relatively the early days of DNA. How much semen did you need to actually profile and get a result?
The traditional technique we were using, the restriction fragment length polymorphism test, required quite a large sample of semen. We would say a stain the size of a 5-cent piece. The new technique, which I was able to use in this case, we could get results on a much, much, much smaller sample. Just a pinprick size stain was sufficient.
Can you tell us a bit about the kind of equipment that you were using?
Oh, yes, it was very manual. We had samples in tubes. We used pipettes to transfer solutions and the DNA from one tube to the next tube and expose it to the next chemical. And that was all done manually. The next step, which is the quantification of the DNA to determine how much DNA we have out of the sample, again, that was very manual. It was a manual process we used. Then the next step in the PCR was to actually copy the DNA that we were interested in. Now, that was when we did actually use a piece of equipment. And if you can imagine a solid block of metal with holes drilled in it, and we put our tubes in the holes. Now, this piece of instrumentation was called a thermal cycler. And the reason it's called a thermal cycler is that that block could become very hot very quickly and then drop in temperature and then go up again and then go down again. And so when we were doing that photocopying, we were actually cycling through a series of different temperatures, which allowed the DNA to be copied. Once the sample was pulled out of that, then we were able to analyse the sample that we had copied. And again, that was a very, very manual process. We did a technique known as electrophoresis, which basically means that we put the samples on a piece of cellulose at one end. It was a rectangular piece of cellulose, put the samples at one end, put an electric current across that cellulose, and the DNA fragments or pieces of DNA that we copied actually moved with the electrical current. The larger fragments moved more quickly than the smaller fragments, and so we were able to separate them. And then we had a visualization process, which again was manual. So it was a very, very manual, hands-on process. These days, a lot of those steps are done by robots in the laboratory.
And of course, at the very beginning, this is something that the average listener might not know. When you're presented with the biological material from the crime scene, it contains a male and a female component.
It may. So my understanding with this particular case is that some instances he had ejaculated outside the house on windows. He was looking inside and ejaculating on the windows, in which case it was just a sample from him and we didn't have to separate male from female. The cases where he'd actually raped the victims and they were examined by a medical practitioner, when they collected the samples, they would have collected biological material from the victim as well as the seminal material or the material from him. And so in those cases, we had to do what we called a differential extraction, which meant that we had to separate the male from the female DNA.
You were testing samples continually. You were finding that...
Okay, so we were able to exclude all of the suspects that the police had collected samples from. Some of them were excluded with the first serological testing, and if they were excluded at that stage, we didn't go any further. If they weren't excluded at that stage, then they went to the first DNA test. If they weren't excluded at that test, they went to the second test.
And were you reading the headlines at the time in the newspapers about this case?
I don't believe so, for two reasons. One, I was basically too busy to read the paper. The other thing is I've been involved in a number of cases which have been reported in the paper, and the facts that are reported and what I actually knew about the case varied significantly. And so I basically take what's in the paper with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm. And of course, while you and your colleagues were working so hard at the lab, there was a lot of other non-scientific work going on at the same time.
Yes, I believe there was quite a large task force, a police task force set up. I believe they had a large number, of the order of 30, 40 police patrolling the streets around the Ascot Vale area at night, every night. And then there was other people who were doing the routine police investigation side of things. They had a large number of suspects. At one stage, I believe there was 177 names on the board. Their names went up and down the board, depending on, how the investigation was going.
There was one point where your scientific work was crucial. It's when the police had a very, very hot suspect from their point of view.
Yes.
And his samples were sent to you for testing. Can you tell us what happened?
So this particular suspect sample went through the traditional serological testing and we couldn't exclude him. Went through the first test and we couldn't exclude him. It went through the second test and we couldn't exclude him. And we hadn't actually got to that stage before because we'd been able to exclude all the other suspects on that range of tests.
And there were a few other things about this suspect, I gather, that made him such a hot suspect. Can you tell us?
Well, from my understanding, he actually matched the description of the offender. He was walking down a street during the night and he was wearing some distinctive shoes. And so he was a prime suspect. And as I say, we couldn't exclude him on all of the tests, and we'd excluded everybody else by the time we'd done the second DNA test. But we didn't exclude him on the second DNA test. So we then used the third DNA test, and we excluded him. And I believe that the task force thought that they had the right man, so we were asked to repeat that third test. We repeated that third test, and again we excluded him. And that information went to the task force that although he had a number of similarities, it wasn't him. And they had to start again.
Can you remember the mood in the lab?
We were hopeful that we had found or we had matched this profile, and therefore the true offender, had been found. We were conscious of the public disquiet, particularly in the Ascot Vale area, and we'd only have to be human to have some sort of feeling for the people living in that area. So when we couldn't exclude him, we thought that this might be the end of the trauma, well, not the end of the trauma, but the end of this stage of the trauma for those people living in that area. But science doesn't lie, and the third test excluded him. We repeated it, and the third test excluded him again.
So in the end, police did find the perpetrator.
Yes.
Can you tell us how that happened?
I believe that he was seen by some police officers in the vicinity of where these rapes had occurred, and he was taken into the police custody and interviewed, and a blood sample was taken, but he was then released. The blood sample came to us. We profiled it, and we found that the DNA matched at all the tests we were undertaking. And they did some good old police investigation, which was also instrumental. And I believe that one of the police officers involved actually saw him on the street. She knew the results, and so she actually followed him and arrested him there and then.
So what do you think would have happened in this case, or might have happened, if DNA hadn't been around?
If there had been no DNA, there would have still been some forensic analysis, but it would have been limited to the serological testing. And the serological testing is relatively limited, and that's why DNA was introduced. They probably wouldn't have linked on the basis of the forensic evidence these cases together. They might have done on the basis of the police investigation. And whether or not they would have actually been able to exclude, well, they wouldn't have been able to exclude all those suspects that we were able to exclude. One of the reasons that DNA was actually introduced is that it is more discriminating than the serological tests. By that I mean that it's more powerful in detecting differences between people. And so it was a much more powerful tool to actually use. So I don't think that forensic evidence would have played such a big part in this investigation if there was no DNA.
And so this man with the sneakers walking around the area near one of the suspects' houses at 3 a.m., what about him?
I'm only guessing, but he would probably have been arrested, charged, and maybe even convicted without the DNA. And that's one of the powerful reasons why DNA was introduced. And we use DNA not because it's what's known as inculpatory, it includes people, but it actually excludes people.
So how did the arrest of Christopher Clarence Hall feel for you personally?
At the time, I found, and I still find this case satisfying. It was a lot of hard work, but we were able to exclude a large number of people from the police investigation, and they were able to get on with their lives. And we were also able to identify the perpetrator, allowing some closure for the women involved. So it was quite satisfying.
Scientists have feelings too. So how difficult is it to be dealing with the blood and semen-stained clothing of the victims of serious assaults or murder?
I think it's really important to be able to compartmentalise work and personal feelings. When I joined the forensic science laboratory, we saw and read about some dreadful things that people did to people. You needed to, as I say, take that step back and not get personally involved.
But there was one time that you weren't able to compartmentalise.
Yes, I had just returned from maternity leave and I had a small son, 6 months old, something like that. And I was asked to examine a nappy of a baby girl. It was alleged that she had been sexually assaulted. So I was asked to examine her nappy for presence of semen. And it was basically, she was the same age as my son. Nappy was the same size. And at that stage, I said no. And I asked to be reassigned, or that case to be reassigned. And I asked not to work on cases with small children at that stage in my career. I went back to it, but just at that time, that was very confronting.
But there was often a personal link in that you were aware of the circumstances of some of the victims of your cases.
Yes, I can remember another case. Again, it was a sexual assault, this time of a schoolgirl. And there was semen on her blazer. And she went to a private school, and the blazers are quite expensive. And I received a message that her mother wanted the blazer back if possible, so she didn't have to buy a new blazer. So I examined the blazer and was able to determine that there was sufficient material actually on one of the pockets of the blazer that I could actually unpick the blazer pocket, retain the blazer pocket with the semen on it, and return the rest of the blazer. And so all she had to do was replace the pocket.
In your time giving evidence as a police forensic scientist, you had a few shocker days in court. Can you tell us about one of them?
I'd like to just, again, take a step back. I wasn't a police forensic scientist. I was a forensic scientist. It's very important to realise that forensic science is impartial. Regardless of the employment agency, the work of a forensic scientist is impartial. And particularly when it comes to going to court, that's particularly important. The expert witness code of conduct, which all expert witnesses have to abide by, actually states that witnesses are a witness for the court, not for the party that calls them. But the case that you were talking about was a country court. And so I had driven up to the court and I was called to give evidence. Now, the first part of giving evidence is what's known as examination in chief, and that's done by the party that calls you. And in this case, it was the prosecutor. And so he took me through my qualifications, why I was an expert, and then through the testing that I had actually undertaken. Now, in this particular case, again, it was a sexual assault matter, and this case was a young girl again, and the accused was the mother's boyfriend. And his semen with a matching profile was found on her underpants. I can't say it's his because we can't positively identify 100% the individual. We put a statistic on it, but was most likely. So that was fine. There was no problems with that. The next stage of the examination is what's known as cross-examination, and that's when the defence counsel asks their questions. Now, normally they would have one or two targeted questions. They might challenge my expertise. They might challenge some of my testing. They might give me an alternative scenario. In this case, the defence counsel got to his feet and he took me back to my qualifications. And he said to me, Mrs. Davey, you have a science degree, is that correct? And I said, yes. He said, what subjects did you do in first year? Now, this would have been, the mid-1990s, and I graduated in 1980. So it was a while ago. So to the best of my recollection, I told him the subjects that I'd studied, the marks I got, the number of hours a week they were. He also wanted to know what the subjects were called. Because I couldn't be completely accurate, he would say things like, Mrs. Davey, you call yourself an expert and you don't even know what you did at university. And then we went to second year and what subjects had I done there, what marks had I got, how many hours a week, etc. Then third year, this continued through third year, my honours, my postgraduate work, and many times I could not recall the exact details. After many hours, and it was many hours, he then put that to one side and he said to me that in this particular case, the seminal material was on the little girl's knickers, and their defence was that the semen had transferred from his underpants to her knickers in the washing machine. And was that possible, and could I comment on that? Now, one of the things with giving expert evidence that's really important is to stay within your bounds, your expertise. I am not an expert on the transfer of biological material in the washing machines. Forensic biologists are, because there have been multiple studies on that, but I didn't know the results of those studies. So I had to say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I'm not an expert. At which stage the judge pipes up and he said, Mr. So-and-so, you've been trying all day to prove that Mrs. Davey is not an expert, and now she's saying she's not an expert. Are you happy? And he said, no, and sat down. And I was excused, and I left court. I drove back to Melbourne, and I know nothing more about that case. But it was just, it was very hard to keep a straight face and not to get cross.
But at the time, I gather you were wondering why the prosecution barrister didn't jump in and object and save you, and you later realised why.
Yes, I actually told this story to another workshop that I was running, and there were a number of people from the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution in the audience, and I'd made some comment about the prosecutor not objecting to the questions. And one of the lawyers came and saw me afterwards, and he said to me that he can't comment on this particular case, but what he thinks was probably happening was that the prosecutor was very aware of the judge and of the jury, because this was a criminal trial, so there was a jury present, and he was watching their body language. And the questions were ridiculous, and everybody could see they were ridiculous. But I appeared to be coping, so he just let it run. And what I think he was saying is that in the eyes of the jury, particularly who had to make the final judgment, this guy just looked like an idiot because he was asking these questions which really had no relevance. And that reinforced a number of other things which have happened over the years, and I learned through my studies, is that the way a case is put together, the lawyers put a case together, is very tactical. They will use any means they can to bolster their case. And in this case, if the defence counsel appeared not to be making any sense or asking stupid questions or silly questions, then his standing with the jury would have reduced, and that would have benefited the prosecution. Now, we'll never know for sure. That's just a hypothesis.
So, Anna, you've worked in the DNA area since it was the early days of DNA in court, and you're, through your private job, very much involved in it today. How has it evolved over that time?
Oh, it's dramatic. It's absolutely dramatic. We've probably got 5 different technologies we've gone through in that period of time. The very, very early DNA profiling, which we didn't actually do in Victoria, we actually entered the field with the second technique. But the very first technique, the profiles that you actually got looked very much like a barcode that you get on a product from the supermarket, and were quite complex to interpret. That was the very first iteration of DNA profiling. The second iteration, which was the one that we introduced in Victoria in 1989, was restriction fragment length polymorphisms. Here we were looking at specific areas of the DNA. They're called loci, or a locus, or multiple loci, and we looked at 5 different areas. When we looked at the results, you got 1 or 2 bands rather than multiple like the barcode. The next stage came in the early 90s, and that was polymerase chain reaction, where we could get results from much, much smaller samples of biological material because we were copying the DNA, as I explained before. When that was first introduced, we looked at 1 area of DNA at a time, 1 locus at a time. And so it was faster than RFLPs, but it was still slow. The next stage of the DNA technology was when methods were developed that we could look at many areas of DNA at once. We're looking at about 21 to 24 areas of DNA at once with the current technology. And that's where we are at the moment. The next technology coming in, which is still in the future, it's being researched at the moment in forensic labs for applicability, and it's being used in universities, is what's known as next-generation sequencing. This technique allows you to look at a lot more DNA at once. It is possible to actually look at all of the DNA using this technique, but for forensic science purposes, we probably won't look at all of the DNA. And this will give us a lot more information, and it will also give us information about physical characteristics. Presently, the DNA techniques that we use, the only physical characteristics that we are able to obtain information on is whether you're male or female. Over the last 20 years, the sensitivity of DNA profiling has greatly increased, almost exponentially. This is great because we can detect smaller samples of biological material, which in years gone past we weren't able to do. And so we can now get a result in cases where we wouldn't have previously got a result, and that's great. However, there is a downside, and that is that because we can detect smaller and smaller amounts of DNA, we can actually detect DNA which has been left on a surface or on an item which has nothing to do with the offence. And there's no way of aging DNA, so we don't know how long that DNA's actually been present. The other issue we have to face is the fact that small amounts of DNA can be transferred from person to person or from item to item. And so we have to be very careful with the interpretation. One of the questions that needs to be asked is, how did the DNA get there?
Thanks, Anna, for coming in today and for telling us about the Ascot Vale Rapist and your general experiences both at the Victoria Police Forensic Lab and then in your extraordinary career to the present as a forensic expert.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Dan Mullins and Jade Murray. Sound design is by Link Kelly.